Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, it's getting back to that idea that the entire place is sacred is one of my the impetus for a lot of what I do, and I think that there's in the old days every place was sacred. And so sacred that, like, the Aborigines in Australia created walkabouts because they didn't even think you should walk on the earth too much because the earth was so sacred. And when the first Aborigines saw the first digging up of the earth by the Scots and the Irish, the head of the tribe had a heart attack right on the spot. So
it's interesting about that because the Aboriginal way is that the earth carries traces of all of not only the gods and goddesses, but the people that have been to a place, and they, their whole culture is all about reading those signals. And I really think that we should begin trying to read those signals also, and begin trying to connect to the earth in a different way. It's all well and good to kind of recycle, which is obviously very important, but that doesn't really solve the fundamental issue, which is that we need to restore the sacrality to the earth. We need to, recognize that, do you know what? This is the only planet we have, and we can't really play around with it. We can't, even if there are religious dicta, we can't really go against that. We have to be very, very careful and to start recognizing how incredibly powerful and valuable this planet is.
Well, I agree. And when we come back in a couple minutes, we're going to talk some more about that. This is Smoke and Mirrors, every Monday through Friday, 6 to 7 in the Pacific. I'm Jay Weidner. We're talking to A.T. Mann, Tad Mann, and we're going to be back in just a couple of minutes. Got to pay for this show, so listen up. And we're back. I'm Jay Weidner. We're listening to the Smoke and Mirrors Radio Hour. We're talking to Atman, Tad Mann, a great mind, written many books, is a genius on architecture, astrology, and a lot of other things. Last week, Tad, we had Robert Lawler on from Australia. Oh, yeah, he's a good friend of mine. He stayed here at my house in April shooting a new video that we're going to have out called The Sacred Geometry of Time. And in that, I think you probably saw his lecture in New York, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, well, he stayed here for almost a month in Hudson on the East Coast,
right,
where I live. And I'd never met him before, although I'd known his books for decades and decades. And we spent an awful lot of time hanging out together and realized how resonant a lot of our ideas were.
Yeah, he's a great mind.
Yeah.
He's really discovered this thing which I have to keep somewhat mum about because I've made promises, but it has to do with this sacred relationship between space and time. And go ahead.
No, that's exactly the issue that I've spent a lot of time actually working with, because to follow on with what I was saying before, that, when you do architecture, it's very interesting because often architects talk about buildings as though they're just objects in space, but when you begin to realize how important this dimension of time is, it begins to mean something very, very different. And it's funny, around the end of the 60s, when I began leaving architecture, I was still very, very successful, but I went away and worked in Rome for a year after being an architect in New York, and I began discovering certain strange arcane substances. And when one took these substances, what happened was that your time sense became dramatically distorted. And it was very, very interesting to me because I discovered that it was possible to really understand time in a profoundly different way because it changed. It morphed. And I also came across the teachings of some extraordinary Russian mystics called Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. And they were primarily interested in bringing the ancient Eastern mysteries, and they were Sufi ideas and Tibetan Buddhist ideas and many others, into a form that was a kind of school. You know, it was a teaching that Gurdjieff instituted, and it was about harmonics and about dance and about rhythm and about time. And I was actually able to, when I began doing astrology in the late 60s, early 70s, I actually developed a lot of the Gurdjieffian ideas into this concept of time that I call lifetime astrology. And one of the most striking aspects of it is that, and everyone out there is going to realize this, that time doesn't stay the same. It has this amazing capacity to change. As we age, as we get older, time moves faster and faster. It accelerates. We begin to feel that passage of time profoundly. And it's one thing to say that the calendar is ending, but there's another whole element of it, which is that our perception of time is changing even now. Most of you out there, I mean, I don't know about you, I'm in my mid-60s, but I begin thinking about the 80s as being relatively recently until I realized with a shock that it was actually 30 years ago or more. And it's intriguing because according to the Gurdjieff and Ouspensky cosmology, we perceive the passage of time logarithmically, meaning when we're young, we see time passing very, very slowly. And as we age, as our metabolism gradually slows down, time accelerates and it moves faster and faster and faster. And not only that does it happen to us as individuals, but it happens to our whole society. You know, they say that the amount of information that we have access to each day right now, and it's quite easy to believe, is equivalent to the information that an individual 110 years ago, around the year 1900, would have access to in a lifetime. And so as a result, we're subject to a kind of information overload, not just on an individual level, but really on a society level. And my astrology is an attempt to try to get people back into synchronization with time. And it's one thing to identify it as an issue, but it's another thing to really show how in your horoscope, in your life, this element of time actually functions. And I just find it endlessly intriguing and interesting.
Well, I do too, actually, and I've spent a lot of time, excuse the pun, looking into it, and I'm actually completely obsessed with it, to be honest with you. And if you go to jayweidner.com, I have an article there called "The Alchemy of Time," which is how the higher dimensional Taurus structures the flow of time. And you can understand how time speeds up as you age, because you're literally going down a funnel or a vortex, or each spin is faster and tighter than the spin before. And in that you can also understand why reincarnation might be a valid concept, because you come out through the other side and you start up again in the same way that you ended. So I think time is really I consider time to be the frontier, the last frontier for all of us. And I just am completely fascinated by it. Also, you can see it in the movies. Talk about that when we come back, too. Okay, I want to hear more about the astrology. We're talking to Tad Mann. You can go to atmann.com. You can go to smokeandmirrorsradio.net. You can go to Sacred Mysteries, where we have a video coming out in a few months with Tad. And I'm Jay Weidner, listening to Smoke and Mirrors. We'll be back in a couple minutes.